is people were referred to as Sodomites. I don't really want to go into great detail, but not only the terminology has extended down for 4,000 years, but as we mentioned last week, the virtual destruction of that area and the fact that nothing grows there to this day. It is just an absolute wasteland. The Dead Sea is called the Dead Sea for a very specific reason. There's nothing grows in that region. And it certainly is different from when Lot was given the choice. We talked about that Lot looked into the Jordan Valley, that it was well watered. That's where he chose to go. And the question that I have in my mind is, and when all of this, and it talks about that righteous Lot was tormented of why someone didn't move away. And we got right down to the last part today. Last week when it said, but Lot's wife behind him looked back and she became a pillar of salt. And the reasons of why she might have looked back. And why do you think she would have looked back? Had family and friends. And we go ahead to the New Testament and it says, remember Lot's wife. Why would that be something that would be important for us to know, to remember Lot's wife? Don't let your family distract you.
If the Lord doesn't have to do something, you better not do it.
Yeah.
Look back on things you might have lost.
Yes, absolutely. Looking back on things we might have lost, and at one point when people said, well, Lord, I'll follow you wherever you go. And when one began to make one excuse and another made another excuse, he said, no one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is worthy for the kingdom of God. Any farmers here? Anybody plow fields? Marion, you plowed fields? When you start at one end of the field and get to the other end, what's the best way to plow a straight line?
It's hard. Once you get started, you just follow the furrow.
Yeah. Getting the first furrow is the hardest one. But after that, if you sort of just let your eyes wander and don't follow that course, ask me how I know this. And as I always say, if you keep your eye on something at the end of the field, make sure it's not a cow. Ask me how I know that one. Yes. Sailing one time with Jack and Maggie, and Jack says, pick out something on the shore and sail towards that. Because I thought, how hard can that be? Not very hard until I take my eye off it, and then I try to find, now where was that thing on the other, what was I looking at next? And then you look behind and you see this wandering path going there. So the fact, but Lot's wife behind him looked back and she became a pillar of salt. And the very fact that that Jesus said, remember Lot's wife, tells us that this is a real event. And we think of, well, is this just a metaphor for something that might have happened? Is this just something to sort of warn us about that type of life? When Jesus said, remember Lot's wife, it tells us that this was a real event. In verse 27, and try to think of ourselves as being there where Abraham was. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. Anybody ever been somewhere to where they see a huge fire way off in the distance? There was excavating, or a company that was burning a brush pile right at the just west of 22 there on 72 a few weeks ago. And as I was driving down Division Road, I thought, wow, look at that. And for myself, I couldn't tell how far it was. But in talking to people say, oh yeah, that sounds like so-and-so's excavated. They knew where it was at. They could tell because they've lived around here. And when Abraham goes out early and he looks down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. Imagine what that looked like, burning, and the smoke of a furnace. Anybody here ever worked in a place that melts steel? Kenny! Quite a column of smoke that goes up from those. Living in northwest Indiana, the steel mills dot the landscape. If you ever fly over, if you're flying into Chicago, you'll fly over top of those. And you can see all of the steel mills that go all the way, that start around just west of Michigan City, and they just dot the landscape going all the way around the corner there. And you see when they, at certain times of day, when they will, the billows of smoke that will come out of there because of the different types of furnaces that are going through there, and you just see it as rising up, and they might be 20, 30 miles away, and you'll see that column of smoke that is rising up there. And think of what Abraham thought, and he put it together, and he connects the dots of the conversation that he had had, and he looks down and sees the smoke, and based on the conversation that he had had back in chapter 18, what would the conclusion be that Abraham came to when he saw the smoke? That there were not 10 righteous people that could be found in there. And we don't know what goes through his mind. And except for what we're going to read at the end of chapter 19, there's nothing more really told about Lot. We read about his descendants, we read about him in the New Testament, but that's really the end of the life that we read about Lot in that area. And he, let's see, wrong page. Okay, so it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, in verse 29, that God remembered Abraham and sent out Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. Remember, God was going to spare the town if they could find 10 people. But remembering that he was going to, that God was going to spare them, he spares Lot in this. And we begin in verse 30. And this is one of the accounts that is very hard for us to understand in some of its, especially in view of what we read in the New Testament. Now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in the cave with his 2 daughters. And if I stopped right there and say, why do you think that Lot would be afraid to live in Zoar? Yes, we aren't really told, but yes, that was what occurred to me, is that perhaps that this town being so close to Sodom and Gomorrah, he might have thought that the destruction was going to come upon Zoar as well. So he lived in the cave with his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come in after us in the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. And so they made their father drink wine at night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she arose. The next day the firstborn said to the younger, behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also. The younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami, and he is the father of the Ammonites to this day. So we have the beginning of the Moabites and the Ammonites, and we're going to read about them as we go through the Old Testament. And if I said, who do we know of that is from the tribe of Moab. Who is a Moabite? A Moabitess. Ruth was from the tribe of Moab, and the Moabites lived to the east of the Jordan River and sort of east and southeast, or directly east of the Dead Sea, but across the Jordan River is where they were. The Ammonites lived a little bit to the south of there. And we have a lot of questions, especially when we read about righteous Lot and what happens to him here. Is there anything in this that said that God was okay with this? No. There's nothing in there that says that God was okay with this. Nothing that said that he wasn't. Okay? It's simply the account of what happened. And for all they knew, verse 31, it says, "And the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth." What do you think was, and we're simply speculating, but what do you think was going in their mind? Why would they make a statement like this? What had they just seen? They'd seen the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and it says that there were actually 5 cities around there that were destroyed, if you go back and read. But he's destroyed all that. For all they knew, that was the end. Now, good, bad, or indifferent, that's the conclusion that they came to. Is that something that we would say, well, yeah, that's the way we should do it today? No, not hardly. But for some reason, that story has been given to us, and it is the beginning of the Moabites and the Ammonites. Yeah.
But he didn't do that, and it was, they obviously got him drunk enough that he didn't even know the incident. And I always wonder, like, in his mind, he's wondering, like, who got these girls? You know, we don't know anything about that part either.
Yeah, we aren't given any facts beyond what we read here. We don't read later of Abraham asking about it. We don't read of Lot asking about it. We're simply given, and this is the beginning of the Ammonites and the Moabites, who are going to come into play later on, and we're going to see that they are not a preferred people of God later on. So it's a very interesting account that is here. Chapter 20 deals with Abraham and Abimelech. We're going to save that because there's 2 instances of which Abraham becomes deceptive about, Sarah is my sister. So we come down to chapter 21, the birth of Isaac. And these are very interesting because they are, go ahead.
I just want to make one more point. In my house, just when, you know, we were talking about there's nothing, nowhere where God said this is wrong, and Mike was saying there's nowhere where he said it's right, or not wrong. But the girls wouldn't have to get the father drunk and deceive them. They knew it was wrong, and they knew that he wouldn't approve of that, or they wouldn't have to be right. So, to me, that is that was wrong.
Yes. What Allie is saying is that if they didn't think it was wrong, they would not have had to get their father drunk in order to carry this out. So within the context of the narrative of that, we understand that as being that way. Now we come down to chapter 21. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of a son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him, and Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So we have that God has followed this through, the promise that God had made in chapter 12 and again in chapter 15 that he was going to make him into a mighty nation. And through his seed, he has brought this to pass, even in spite of the fact that Sarah said she had a better way of doing this, and she brought Hagar into the picture, which we're going to read now in verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned. How old is a child when it is weaned? Over 2. And for some of us who might say, what does it mean to wean a child? Okay, take it off milk and start to introduce it into solid food. Okay, that's what it means to wean. And for different cultures, we might think in terms of, even within the United States, that some children are weaned at a very young age. 6 to 9 months, okay? We have cases to where we have read that children aren't weaned. They're still on the milk when they are 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. That might be a little extreme, but we understand that the child is young and the child is weaned. He said, and the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. How many here had a great feast for their child on the day that it was weaned? You know, so, yeah, yes. And so we can see that there's something going on here culturally that is obviously different from what we perceive, is that there was a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba.
That's where I have a question. He makes both children leaders of a great nation. One becomes Islam, one becomes Christian. Why would he make a person a great leader of the nation of Islam that wants to kill Christians?
The child, if we go over to Galatians chapter 4, let's go over to Galatians chapter 4, and we'll come to that answer. Galatians, Ephesians, verse 21 of Galatians chapter 4. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it was written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave woman was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically. And so he tells that story. So it tells us that one was born according to the promise, and that would have been Isaac. Ishmael was going to be blessed. It was not God's intention through this that Ishmael would be born and then become the leader of Islam. That is man's decision. But Isaac, through Isaac, the seed line would go. And Isaac was to be that through which here it tells us that the promise was coming through Isaac. Through that would come Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And through Jacob, then the 12 patriarchs. So the law would come down through that eventually. But Ishmael, which he makes into a great nation, would become the Arabs, many of the Arab nations. He makes them into a great nation. Do you think it was God's intention to form Islam? Whose decision was it? Mm-hmm. But the great nation was a great nation before Islam. Islam that happens much later, but he would become the great nation before that. And so we read about those who became princes. It gives us a genealogy in that. He is the only son of the promise. May not make sense, but in God's eyes, it does make sense. Because we think, well, he did have two sons, but he only had one son by the promise in that. And it may be tough for us to grasp in that sense, but it is the one that God had promised. Irregardless of what Sarah might have tried through Hagar, God was all the time talking about that son which he would have of the promise, which was going to be the one that would be born through Sarah. We may not agree with it, we may not understand it, but it is what God had prescribed, that it was going to come down through Isaac. Yeah, there is a tremendous amount that's going on culturally here that we don't always grasp in our Western world.
Sarah did that because of her lack of faith. God promised, but Sarah was old age, and she got Hagar because she had lack of faith.
But did she think of this all by herself, or is it something that's been going on in the past?
I don't think we know.
Yeah. Sometimes we have to say, speak where the Bible speaks, be silent where the Bible's silent. That's all we have to go by. There's nothing that gives us the yay or the nay, but it was Sarah's decision. And we don't ever read that God said, yeah, go ahead and do that. We just don't read it.
That was an acceptable practice at that time. Not to go against God's will, not to be impatient, but as a general rule of life, it was accepted that they could have other relations.
Mm-hmm.
God never condoned it, though. He said one life, he puts up with
Yes.
If they'd have just had Isaac, we wouldn't have had all this problem.
We wouldn't have this discussion.
Yeah. We might not even be here. We might still be living over there. But remember when Abraham was questioning God and said, I don't have any offspring. My steward is going to inherit everything. So there must have been a custom there that when he passed, that his chief steward was going to inherit everything. And it's not spelled out there, but by virtue of the fact that Abraham says this, it must have been some sort of tradition that we don't really understand, but it was the way that things were done. But God says, no, you are going to have a son. Yeah. And God was the God of Ishmael. But when we read of how they describe the God of heaven, it's not called the God of Abraham, the God of Ishmael, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. It's always called the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, because he's clearly delineating how the lineage is going to get to Christ. Wilma, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to mention that while it was a practice often to, have children by your servants, but all these years, Sarah had been seemingly content maybe, but at least she had been without children, and she didn't need to take it into her own hands to give her servant lady until she had this promise from God in her old age. And so she just didn't have enough faith that he was going to follow through, it appears. And so she would help him out by doing something that was common practice often, it appears, from reading other passages and things. And so it was that God was going to follow through on his promise. And so Ishmael wasn't in that lineage.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and oftentimes as we read through, according to the customs of the time, who was it that was designated among the male descendants to be the person that was going to inherit? It's always going to be the firstborn. But what does God do with Adam? And so it is not the firstborn who becomes part of that lineage. And when we read in Genesis chapter 5, we read those names. There's no way of knowing if those children listed in chapter 5 are actually the firstborn. They are only listed as the people to whom that lineage, the same lineage you read in the New Testament, of what they came down through. And when we think of the descendants of Abraham, wasn't the firstborn. And from Jacob, it wasn't the firstborn. And Joseph, it wasn't. So, and of David, he was not the firstborn. Of Jesse, he was the youngest. So God always takes his plan into account, and even if it goes against the customs of the time, his will is always done. And we always understand his will, right? If you raise your hand, I will come and sit in your seat, and you come up here. Yes, we don't always, and we aren't always given the reasons behind every single passage that we're given to understand Lot and his two daughters. Why was it that God told them not to look back? We don't really know.
Probably because the devastation that's being done to that city was so devastating that if you look back, they would be burned into your mind, and
And that's a reasonable assumption, but why are we told not to look back here? And that's a reasonable assumption. But why were they told not to look back? But they didn't know that. The answer is, we aren't told. All we're told is, don't look back. That's enough. I told you, don't look back. No, we shouldn't. It might, and those are conclusions that are easy for us to come to. And when we link it to what Jesus said, remember Lot's wife, who turned into a pillar of salt. But when Jesus says, to remember Lot's wife, how does he explain that? Careful, careful. He doesn't. He says, remember Lot's wife? Because she was told not to do something, and she went against it. It's simply, remember that when God gives a command, he expects it to be obeyed. Not always understood, but simply to be obeyed. Yeah, that was the order. Don't touch it. And you're right. It might have slid off the cart. Well, they would have suffered the consequences of that. But the command was, do not touch it. Later on, we're going to read in the New Testament where God says, go into all the world. Those who believe and are baptized shall be saved. Do we understand every little iota of detail? If you're a scholar, you might understand a lot of what goes on within the realm of baptism. But that's the command, isn't it? We start to reason as to say, well, I don't think it really has to be done. How about this guy named Naaman? Naaman is told to go down and dip into the Jordan how many times? Okay? But he reasons in his mind that we have better rivers where I'm from. They're a lot cleaner. Tim, you went across the Jordan. Tell me about that. Tell me about the pure waters of the Jordan. Yeah, it's like bad coffee. That's what everybody who's seen it says, yeah, there ain't anything spectacular about that. And he reasons in his mind. And the servants say, if he told you something hard to do, you'd do it, wouldn't you? That's really the gist of it. So he does it. So he goes down and he dips one time and he's cleaned, right? Twice? How many times does Naaman have to do it? Why does he have to do it 7 times? Because God said it. You don't always have to understand a commandment to do it. Now we understand when it says, do not lie. Don't steal. Don't kill. Right? Oh, I knew somebody was going to challenge that. Yes, yeah. We may not always live up to it, which is why he came. But we understand inherently the commandments of why we're commanded to do things. It could be, and that is reasonable, but why 7 times? Because God said so. Because God said so. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. And so in Genesis chapter 21, how did I get so far away from that? As we come down to verse 12, it says, "For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away, and she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And Beersheba was in the southern part of Judea, going down towards Egypt. Dan was up at the top and Beersheba was at the bottom when you look at that. And when the water in the skin was gone, she put a child under one of the bushes, and she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Let me not look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept, and God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes and saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up and lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. And there we have the beginning of the nation that sprung out from Ishmael there. But because it tells us because he was from Abraham, it says that he's going to make him into a great nation. I'm done. And that was the second bell? A while ago. Okay.